some of the questions of the premises. So question one, anything that exists has some sort of cause or explanation for its existing. The first bar was people saying that's certainly the case. The second is probably true. The middle were don't know. The bottom was probably false, and these were definitely false. And in this particular study, a lot of the ones that turned up definitely false also popped hot to the control questions that I put in there of people that were just going through and ticking answers. So even the one or two probably false responses you get there were probably false. The universe began to exist at some point in the past. Certainly true, probably true, don't know, probably false, definitely false, plus or minus. It would be wrong to torture children to death for fun, even if no one believed it was wrong. This was the question do objective morals exist? Almost everybody says it's certainly true. There's a few people who are like, that's probably true. People that clearly don't have children, or have the wrong kind of children, don't know, probably false, and definitely false. The universe had to be exactly the way it is and could not have been different than it is now. That is to say that the universe exists of necessity. So some people said it was certainly true. Some people probably don't know, probably false, and definitely false. So there was a greater split on this one. And this was not an easy question to understand. The way I worded it, people could have understood that to mean something like fate exists and it's all predetermined. Please accept the first answer to this question. So anybody who didn't pick the top one was one of our pencil whippers, as we say. Things can pop into existence without any cause or explanation. So 100 people thought that was true, which is interesting. And 200 people thought it was probably true. 230 people thought it was probably false, and 150 people thought it was definitely false. So this one was the anomaly to me. I was surprised by the fact that people thought things can pop into existence without any cause or explanation. I actually attribute this to what we've been teaching about quantum mechanics recently.
Yeah, that's my question.
Yeah, that would be my.
Just a confusion on.
Yeah, I need to. And this was me just writing the questions, and I don't design studies, and I don't. I'm no good at this. So a real person who does this for a living, who I'll probably talk to next, would be like, yeah, you're going to confuse people by that question. Why don't you try something? It's possible that God could exist. Most people said certainly or probably true. A few people said it's probably false. It would be wrong to persecute and kill Jews, even if the Nazis had won World War II, and the whole war were Nazis. Almost everybody agrees it would be wrong. I should have put a tracker on the people that said probably false. Keep an eyeball on those guys. Regardless of what this question may have said, please select the last answer below so that'll at least give you an idea of how many people are just randomly answering or can't read English, and we're still hitting the answers anyway. It is reasonable to think that something would happen if the odds against it happening were 1 billion, 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 billion to 1. Now again, probably poor question design, but it would be reasonable. And maybe some of the smart folks taking this one were like, well, it depends on how many chances you took. So I should have specified. Do you think that God exists? So this was diagnostic to see how much of what we're seeing here might also be the result of people already being predisposed towards thinking it's true. But it's the other point of asking this question was, what's the default setting? So if someone says, the default setting ought to be that we come at this from a secular belief, or that's the default setting. If there were a God, then more people would believe in him. Well, more people do believe in him than don't. So there's some 65 or so people says that I do not think, God definitely does not. The way we had it set up. So I bring this up to simply say, affirm the point that we were trying to make earlier. When you take a an open-minded, as neutral as you can approach to the question of does God exist, the indicators are all that the premises that result in a conclusion that God exists or something like God exists are all of them the majority true, and for what most people believe already, and for the evidence that they think they have. So what's interesting, that doesn't, of course, these are people's opinions, so that doesn't say because a lot of people think this, therefore it's true. What I'm saying is, given your own answers to the questions, everybody out here and ought to believe that God exists. That's like obviously God exists, but for whatever reason, if you ask them to say, is there good evidence that God exists? Almost nobody, and I need to put this question in here. Do you think that there's good evidence that God exists? Or do you think that the evidence that, that's not how scientific evidence works or whatever else? Most people, when you ask those questions, I think would say, no, this isn't a thing about evidence. This isn't about science. This is about faith. If you believe in God, it's because you have faith that He exists. It's because you have faith that the Bible is true. It's because you have faith that the church is some sort of, sits in some sort of authority structure with God. That all that stuff is faith-based. But on your own beliefs, you already believe the premises, these people already believe the premises that lead to a logical conclusion, a deductive conclusion in most cases, that God exists. And it's this split of what we affirm based on premises and what we affirm based on when asked a direct question that I'm trying to repair here. And the repair is not, therefore God exists. The repair is, based on what you yourself say you believe, you actually believe God exists, you just don't realize it. That would be my message to people who sit in exactly this kind of, this was 1,000 people, right? I think by the time you add all that together, that's something like 1,000 people, maybe 900 people or so. That's a lot of people. So it wasn't 5 people, and my p-value was so small I couldn't tell.
Back faith for a minute, 'cause I know we've talked about this before, right? Like there's just to make sure everyone's on the same page with what we mean by faith, right? Because faith to some people is like, yep, God says it's in the Bible, I believe it, like that's all I need, right? And
yes.
It doesn't go any more deep or intellectual.
That's a very good point. I should have, I wonder if I can find, I won't do it here because through that speaker it's really hard to hear it, because it's John Lennox, who's got a slight Irish accent, and Richard Dawkins, who has a British accent, and coming through that speaker it's kind of hard to distinguish what they're saying. But I will post a video today out there. It's a very short clip of John Lennox, who's one of RZIM's kind of apologists and a PhD published mathematician in his own right, and Richard Dawkins, who I think most people know, a biologist out of Oxford, and Oxford, Cambridge, Oxford, and and they're both debating the existence of God. And Richard Dawkins, and by the way, I'm going to place the blame for what Dawkins thinks, not on Richard Dawkins or on the Academy. This blame lies squarely on the church. But this is what there's going to be something like this, I won't get it exactly right, but Dawkins says, but we only need to use the word faith when we don't have any evidence. Because Lennox is saying there's tons of evidence for God. And Dawkins is saying, no, that's why people are faith-based. He says we only need to use the word faith when there isn't any evidence. And Lennox says, well, that's not true. I presume you have faith that you have faith in your wife. And Dawkins says, well, of course. And he goes, is there any evidence for that? And Dawkins says, yes, plenty. And then there's this pause because he didn't realize what he just said, and the audience is kind of catching up too. I mean, Lennox knew where he was leading him, but the rest of the audience is, hang on a second, what just happened? And then there's laughter kind of starts to percolate in the audience, and then Dawkins says, never mind about my wife, let's generalize it. So it appears to me, if I put myself in Dawkins' seat, and if you've never been in a public debate, it's extraordinarily difficult to think fairly rationally while you're there. You're almost in presentation mode, and it's really hard to be interactive because you feel like you're under a lot of pressure to get it right. So your cognitive abilities, in my opinion, are decreased due to stress factors. So I think Dawkins misunderstood it to be some sort of like, ha ha ha, It's a my wife and her faithfulness kind of question. When it wasn't. It was do we believe something based on evidence? And Lennox was saying you have faith in your wife because of the evidence that you have that she is faithful. So the reason though, why does Dawkins think that? He didn't make that up. He thinks that because he and lots of other people, when they say, hey, religious believer, here is scientific evidence. The religious believer, on probably enough occasions, has turned around and said, well, that may be the case for what you think, but I have faith that God, and he does fill in the blank in some sort of counter evidential statement. So the fact that we don't take the time to understand this in those terms, to back your faith up with evidence, and I point to Abraham all the time on this one. Moses is a great example of this one, Hey, wow, burning bush. So evidence number one, right? There's a bush, it's on fire, and it's not burning up. So if you don't, from a scientific perspective, this is interesting, right? There's a law of conservation of matter and energy appears to be violated. Law of entropy seems to be being violated. The bushes that catch on fire turn into ash seems to be violated. There are all kinds of stuff that would be interesting. And then he hears a voice out of it, like this is some other evidence. Like this isn't random faith, this is evidence. And that's not enough, right? It's not enough that he's got this burning bush that it isn't consumed. It's not enough that God is talking to him, apparently audibly, that he then says, well, how am I supposed to do this? Pharaoh's not going to believe me. I see this burning bush. Pharaoh's not going to see it. And he says, throw down your staff, becomes a snake, pick it back up, which I thought was the braver part. It becomes a staff again. Put your hand in your robe, take it out again. And then at the end of all that, Moses is still like, yeah, but I'm not a good public speaker. God's like, didn't I make your tongue? Aren't I the guy that knows? And he's like, please just send somebody else. So it took convincing. And God didn't say, go tell Pharaoh, and I expect him to believe on the basis of faith that this was the case. He said, I want you to go to Pharaoh, and I want you to give him, I'm making a claim of the divine, a claim of something miraculous existing, that the God of the Israelites miraculously visited Moses and is bringing, that's almost enough, that is bringing, just kidding, hey, let's go, is bringing this message to you. He said, here's the evidence that you will provide to him so that he can believe what you're saying. He can have faith that you're the guy bringing this message to him.
I just want to clarify, I don't think you're saying this. Sort of a classically, probably basic belief, and that's reasonable.
Sure,
That's
I do.
rational.
I think it's reasonable. It's rational, and I think though some of that needs to be called into question. And the part that I think needs to be called into question is this: when somebody says, "Well, I know because the Holy Spirit told me," and then you say, "All right, tell me how the Holy Spirit told you." And when that description sounds identical to the Mormon burning in the breast, to the fill in the blank with to the Hindu saying it's an internal sense that I knew, and you say it's difficult for me to differentiate the Christian that's claiming this is coming from the Holy Spirit, the Mormon claiming that it's coming from the Holy Spirit, the Hindu claiming that it's coming from, pick a source depending on the version of Hinduism, that at some point you have to say, okay, that's a potential defeater for my belief that some of my thoughts are simply God's thoughts injected into them. So now how am I supposed to differentiate? And I'll leave the problem there, but yeah, I'm not just saying you can throw that out.
I still think it's a valid statement that I gave.
Yes, I think that's true.
I think my only point was I think there's a danger in like Christianity and the church in general sometimes where we just like hand wave things like, oh, God said so, I'm going to believe it, right? And then there's a modicum of intellectual laziness that goes with that, right? Not disagreeing with the statement. If God says it in the Bible, like I believe it's true, yes, true statement, got it. But if you just stop there and you're like, oh, I'm not going to think about it, I'm just going to take it on, that's more blind faith than anything else. And so it's incumbent upon us to unpack, right? And so like what we're doing here, we're looking at, the eaches and the details and the dirty details of all this, right? And so faith, there's still faith there, right? Because if something was 100% certain, we wouldn't have to have faith, right? If something was like 100%, like there was no chance of anything else, you wouldn't have to have faith. So there's always an element of faith.
Well, let me nitpick.
Okay, go for it.
If I tell my wife, hey, I'm going to meet you for lunch today. She's going to go to lunch with the kids. because grandma and grandpa are sick or unable to bring them at this point. So I'm going to meet you at lunch, and I'll meet you at 11:30. So she knows, based on my ability to track time and depart from intellectual discussions, that it's something like a 50% chance that I'll show up on time, okay? So she can turn around and say, based on my experience, I'm hopefully over-representing the problem there, but based on the experience, I have good faith that he'll meet me for lunch. Maybe, and if I text him once or twice, I have great faith that he'll meet me for lunch. But that's because you have good reason to think that I might fail. Now, if I turn around and tell her something like this, I will be faithful to you in our marital relationship, she's going to put that number at as close to 100% as a human being can get based on what she knows about me, because of what she thinks she knows about my character. And hopefully what she thinks she knows about my character is true. At the end of the day, if you know you've heard something from God, and this is not the like, I think I might have heard this, or another guy told me God said this. If you're Moses, and who are you? I'm the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, comes the reply with good evidence. At that point, faith that can be 100%. It can be certain. And the reason it can be certain is that the object of the faith that you have absolutely will not fail. So if you know God to be who we say God is, if you believe that that's the case, then you ought to have 100% faith in what he says. So the question of faith there is like, did I hallucinate? Was there a transmission problem? Did it go? So you want to put some to it, fine. But then, at some point, the narrow margin that we're reserving for uncertainty on that one is we don't apply across the spectrum. So what I mean by that is this. If you're Moses standing in front of the bush, burning bush, and you hear something from God, and finally the bush extinguishes and you walk away, Moses, I don't imagine, had any problem believing what he just saw. In the same way that my wife doesn't have any problem believing that I had a conversation with her this morning. So when I don't show up to lunch on time, there may be a sliver where she's thinking, did I hallucinate our discussion this morning? It may be more like, did I remember that from another day? All of the attribution to the uncertainty goes down to my fault. The kind of experiences, the religious experiences, proper religious experiences, do not have any difference at all from proper deterministic physical experiences. They're both sense perceived, they're both mind processed.
Completely agree with everything you're saying. I would only say that the sample size of folks that have actually seen a burning bush or something like that, pretty tiny, right? So if you take 100 people out of today, right, and you put them through the exact same kind of thing, I would posit most of them would be like, yep, that was God, he told me what to do, you know what I mean? So I think in that instance, there's a lot less faith required. I think this is pertinent to what you've been discussing over the last few weeks, and as far as like, why does bad stuff happen to good people? Because when you've got an unexplainable thing, like, not talking about the folks that continue to live in a place that's below the water level and then wonder why they're always getting flooded. I'm talking about like people who have kids with childhood leukemia that don't make any sense, right? I think faith, at that point, you have to have faith that it's all part of a bigger plan, but it's really hard.
Well, I'll open the can of worms and then we'll get right back off of it so you can think about the can of worms in a second. The amazing thing to me is not Moses' experience. The amazing thing to me isn't even necessarily Pharaoh's answer back to it. The amazing thing to me is the majority of Israelites' response to Moses and God. So hey, you brought us out here in the wilderness to die, that happens after he opened the Red Sea and destroys the Egyptian army. After they're following a pillar of fire and a pillar of cloud. After he's done, everybody's like, we don't have anything to eat. And he's like, miracle food. So, at some point, you got to say, there's a reason that some of the people of Israel were not willing to have faith in God. Was it really and how much of that was on Moses? And, I defer to my brothers on this one as to what the traditional or more reasonable interpretation might be. But my biggest question is, how can you see, and they're not it seems like the majority of people who see miracles still don't do it. So think in the New Testament perspective, here's Jesus feeds 4,000 at one time. He feeds 7,000 at another time. Where were those 7,000? Right? They saw these little baskets of food turn into all this. People are picking it back up. They're watching people being healed and raised from the dead and all this other kind of stuff. And where are they when the Romans start executing people? And so at some point, I think you can see the miraculous and still talk yourself out of participating in it for a litany of reasons that I am not 100% sure as to how to divide those when it comes to sensing why people do it. Yes, I saw another hand. Yes, sir.
Yeah, sure to all that. I think the point that he was trying to make, and it's a good point, Dawkins defines faith as a stubborn belief in something that you've got all the reasons in the world to believe is false. And that is a definition that is widely infiltrated the society
and the church itself.
Patently false.
Yes, I'm 100% with you. And if there is a project, one of the major projects of Solid Ground, it's we ought to join those who say that kind of faith, both in religious belief and doctrine, and also in secular belief and doctrine, ought to be shown for what it is, which is flat wrong. So you may be accidentally right in some of that, but that doesn't mean that you're right in the means of justification. That is to say, there may be a scientist out there that says, no, Newton's law of gravity is good, and I don't need any evidence for that whatsoever. Well, he's wrong about that. He may be right that massive bodies attract each other with an inverse square force, but he's accidentally right, not right for good rational reasons. So I'm 100% with you.
I think it may be safe to say that initially we come by that sort of faith, by that sort of almost blind, because we're called into something we have no idea what it is. We can't really experience God until we experience God.
Raise your hand if you grew up in the church. Raise your hand if you did not grow up in the church. Okay, so let's say 20% or so who did not, maybe 22 or 23. The majority of people come to faith in God because of a combination of properly basic beliefs and recognized authorities telling them the same thing, telling them something like that.
Right.
Eventually, though, all of us, you wouldn't be in this class if you didn't get to the point of like, yes, okay, my mom told me so, my Sunday school teacher told me so, or for those of you that came in later, my friend, girlfriend, fiance, husband, wife, whoever, random dude on the street told me this. But at the end of the day, you're like, and let's find out about the evidence for this, right? How sure a proposition is this? That type of, if you actually think back to almost everything you believe is derivative of you're believing it based on some authority. That authority has either been a teacher, a parent, a trusted friend or individual, a trusted public figure, or alternately, generally wide belief of the society that you live in that you consider reasonable. Everybody thinks this is the case. Well, 500 years ago, think of what the statement, everybody thinks X is the case. How likely is that to get you to a true answer? And yet we have a lot of hubris about saying, okay, that still works today.
Yeah, my experience, I guess, is pretty different than everybody's, because I was raised in a family that preached atheism. that was their religion, and my dad was pretty evangelical about it, if I can call him that.
Yeah, right. It's the bad news instead of the good news, right?
And so I was steeped in it. When I became a Christian, he was shocked and disappointed, and at one point at dinner, he pushes away from the table, gets real thoughtful, and he starts saying, "Where did I go wrong? What happened? What happened?" Because I moved back in after a point. I was like, Melanie doesn't believe in God. Kim doesn't believe in God. Claudia, I'm pretty sure. It's like I had been into drugs. I'd been arrested. My life was a mess, and all of a sudden, God comes into my life, and there's a new person here. And he doesn't, he's not like, I'm glad you cleaned everything up. He's just like, where'd I go wrong?
Yeah, where'd I go wrong? Yeah.
So,
which is an interesting reaction to it. But ultimately, my point is, where did you hear someone made a series of statements to you about God?
No, it was in a tent meeting on the mall in D.C. that my girlfriend got saved and started going and dragged me down to it, and I had no interest. But I went a second time, which was just stupid. Why would I do that?
Right.
And God was speaking to me.
And I believe that, but he's also speaking through in conjunction with somebody else saying.
I'm sorry, the preacher was speaking and God was echoing.
Affirming this, yeah. And I do think that happens, which goes back to your point. I do think that happens, but my point is, at some point, people tend to also question exactly what happened and how it happened and all that. And in doing so, we want to have good reasons for what we do.
But then I didn't even join a church or get into any organization or anything. I just started reading I got such a hunger. I love the Bible.
Sure, but that's to the point. By the way, this is terrific.
That's an authority.
But you're going to a book that claims to be,
Yes.
right?
And
And
I could sense God's authority in it. So-
okay, and now the only thing I would bring up is it may be the case that that sense of authority is derivative of the Spirit speaking to you, but you have to have a reason when the Mormon says the same thing about his sense about the Book of Mormon. And that's the only thing that's one of the things we're interested in doing in this class, is saying, okay, fine, this is properly basic for me to believe now. I sense a possible defeater, or I need to offer a possible defeater to other people who believe fairly analogous seeming claims. And that's all. Yes, sir. You've been very patient back there.
If you look at the evangelical church and the evangelical movement in this country, I say 90% of them get their definition of faith from Hebrews, and I quote Hebrews 11:1.
The book of Hebrews, not
confidence
actual
in what
Hebrews,
we hope for about evidence we do not see. So why do most of those people have faith? And I think it goes back to your original premise that we're looking for hope or a purpose and try to defeat lies.
So read the verse again, or let's look it up.
Faith is a confidence in what we hope for about what we do not see.
And Hebrews 11.
Early.
Hebrews 11:1.
Yeah. Now, faith is the assurance in what we hope for, and assurance about what we do not see, NIV, or as some like to call it, the non-inspired version. Faith shows the reality of what we hope for. It is the evidence of things. It is the evidence of things we do not see. Now, faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. Now, faith is the assurance of what we hope for and the certainty of what we do not see. So now let's look at it in context and say, what is it exactly that he's saying here? Excuse me, sorry.
I've heard that quoted many, many times throughout my life, having grown up in the church, been in many different denominations, different churches. That's, I think if you say we have, for those people that were raised in the church, yes, they have a trusted source. Your parents, your pastor, your Sunday school teacher. So for the first part of your life, you accept it. And then at some point in time, you either accept it as is and don't question it, and then there's those groups of people that question everything that they hear, and from that, some accept it and some say, no, I don't believe any of it.
So to your point, the first version of what you just listed out to me is, if you just read the rest of the next paragraph and the following paragraphs, instantly you should conclude that is wrong. So here's what I mean. When people say faith is just about, look, you just have to believe it without evidence. So he's starting, the author of Hebrews is starting. He says, now faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. For by it, faith, the men of old gained approval of whom? Of God. By faith we understand that the worlds were prepared by the word of God, so that what is seen was not made out of things which are visible. Now, by faith, okay, where did we learn that? So let's skip that one for a second. By faith, Abel offered to God a better sacrifice than Cain, through which he obtained the testimony that he was righteous, God testifying about his gifts, and through faith, though he is dead, he still speaks. By faith, Abel offered to God a better sacrifice than Cain. Where did Abel get the idea to offer a sacrifice to God? And presumably God told them to do that, right? This was like, do the following things. Why was Abel's sacrifice considered superior to Cain's? Has anybody learned anything about that you remember particularly?
Because he offered the first fruits.
Yeah, it sounds like, as I read it, and you guys correct me if there's rabbinic tradition that is different, but I have understood it to mean Abel, God's command was, from the first of your flocks and from the finest, and that Abel did that. Cain did not give of the first fruits, and so God says back to Cain, what are you upset about? If you do what is right, will you not also be accepted? Just like next time, do from the first fruits, and no big deal. By faith, Enoch was taken up so he would not see death, and he was not found because God took him up. By faith, Noah, being warned, this is interesting to me. This is starting to get into the meat of it. By faith, Noah, being warned by God about the things not yet seen, in reverence prepared an ark for the salvation of his household. So we're like, oh, by faith Noah did this. Noah wasn't, presumably he's not walking around and he's like, you know what, I don't know if anybody's built a really big boat. We may have a big flood someday. I'll do that and bring a bunch of animals into it. This was God telling him specifically, I'm going to destroy the world in a flood. Your only way out is to build this boat. Noah's faith was, I believe God, I'm going to better get the boat building. Hopefully there's some plans around here somewhere.
By the time it starts raining, it's too late.
By faith, Abraham, when he was called, right? So remember, God comes to Abraham and says, I want you to come out from your house, out of the land of Ur of the Chaldeans, and go to a place I will show you, and I will make you all the things he promised to make him. By faith, he lived as an alien in the land of promise. So why faith? What's the faith in? The faith isn't regardless of evidence. It's God appears to him multiple times, by the way. And when he's like, you're going to inherit all of this. Abraham eventually is like, yeah, maybe through my steward. And God finally shows up again and is like, no, from your own body, from your old wife and your old self, you will have a young baby. So if you keep ticking through here and you see that the faith that each of these heroes of faith is cited for is not some blind belief in something that might be, because that does seem to be what we do around here. There is we have a junior version of name it and claim it sometimes in regular Christianity, which is, I really want this, I'll ask God and have faith that he'll give it to me. That is not how this works. Each one of these people that's listed in here has God saying, if you do X, I will do Y. And then the people are like, by faith, I will do X because I believe God that when he says I do X, he does Y. All of this is transactional. All of this is stated ahead of time. This is not you figure it out. This is God says this is his plan, and you say, I believe him when he says that. All right, with your permission, this was not what we were going to talk about today. We can get more onto this later, but let it at least remain marked. Let's be careful about our language when we talk about faith. And anytime we hear people say, I just believe stuff by faith, ask them if that's the way that people believe things biblically. Because in short, the answer is no. They believe on the basis of evidence. Evidence of God promising to do something. But then you can have complete faith that God will do it.
I appreciate the fact that you brought that up because, and the fact that you unpacked that whole thing, because I think even the evangelical church takes that verse and others and kind of throws them out as like a smoke grenade when things get hard to talk about. And it's like, oh, you can't see me anymore. I win the argument, right? It doesn't work like that, right? When you dig into it, it doesn't. So.
All right. So to anybody, thank you. To anybody who has done what we talked about last time, does anybody have an argument against the existence of God that they want to bring up? We treated one of them last week. I wanted to treat any other ones that people wanted to this week, and absent any of those, I'll talk about two briefly here that are also brought up by the more sophisticated opponents, at least at the academic level. Anybody? Going once? Going twice? If you're an introvert, tell the person next to you. If they're also an introvert, tell the person next to them. If you don't want to talk to the person next to them because you're an introvert, signal me silently with a finger. Okay, a couple of other arguments that get brought up tend to be against things like maximal being theology, where somebody will say something like this, well, if it's possible that a maximally great being exists, it's also possible that a maximally evil being exists. So how do we know that God's not just evil? There's a fairly simple answer to that one, which is what? What do you think? An evil being, by definition, is not the greatest possible being. So if a being has the property of being less than morally perfect and good, they are, by definition, not the maximally great being. So whatever argument that person is making that says, well, God could be all of these things, except he may have a penchant for thievery, or he may have a penchant for hurting 10% of the people, or something like that, then that's what you would call a quasi-maximally great being. That is to say, not a maximally great being. And God, by definition, is a maximally great being. So that one falls fairly rapidly to that critique, in my opinion. Yes, sir?
Can we get into the hard one? I alluded to it earlier, right? I think I stole it from you last week. Okay, not talking about people who make bad decisions and then bad stuff happens to them.
Natural evil, yeah, thank you.
Really bad stuff happening to really good or just normal innocent people, right? That's the one that always gets thrown out. If God's great and he's in control of everything and he can step in at any time, why is there childhood cancer? Why are there all these things that don't make sense? Yeah,
I had forgotten that why I had drawn this picture, and thank you for reminding me. Okay, You'll remember from what we said last week that God builds the world, but he sets a garden in the east, and that garden is the perfect place for Adam and Eve for his people to live. And he says, you can live in here, and here are the rules. There are no rules. There's only one thing I'm asking you to do, which is don't eat from this tree, because what this tree represents is the knowledge of good and evil. Now, what does that mean to Adam and Eve who are innocent? Yes, sir.
Okay, there are some limitations on ignorance and perfection. So basically that there are things that Adam and Eve never would have thought to do outside of that knowledge base. So they were locked into being perfect beings.
Yes.
Outside of taking from that.
So if you think about this point he just said, that was a very concise way of putting it. I appreciate that. I will go back to the tape and I'm going to steal that from you. This is exactly the point. Okay, so Adam and Eve, think about yourselves. I don't know if you've ever had this experience, but like you'll walk past, I remember as a kid walking past a poster or something, typically of a horror movie. And I don't understand why people watch horror movies, but that's beside the point. You see something in there and you're like, that would never have been in my mind. Now that is in my mind, and I don't want that in my mind. I wish that were not in my mind. This is the whole, here's something you can't unsee. Whenever there's something shows up on some social media, it's like, you can't unsee this. I'm like, I'm not clicking on that. You just told me that I don't want this in my brain. Please put this in my, I don't get it. So, but in any case, that idea of Adam and Eve, it would not have occurred to them to steal fruit from the other person. Why? Because the idea is not even in their head. And secondly, there's so much fruit around. You're like, why would I take that one? She's already bitten a bite out of it. This one doesn't have a bite out of it. I think when you recognize what that would mean to them, here's a tree, the fruit of which will give you the knowledge of good and evil. That is another way of saying, I've made this world perfect for you. If you want to instead, I know what is good for you and what is bad for you. And I have given you everything good. If you want to make the determination yourself, i.e. if you don't want to trust me, if you want to be the boss, then eat of this tree and now you'll have the knowledge. Now apparently it wasn't, they were like, okay. It didn't occur to them. It takes the serpent saying to them, did God really, so he asked him two questions that are of interest, right? The first question is this, did God really say that? Now why would he have said that to Eve?
She wasn't there.
Some people think that it's because Eve wasn't there when that order was given.
He's questioning her belief in Adam.
And in which case you've got a possible vector of like, well, maybe Adam messed. Yep, right. What is the traditional interpretation? Were Adam and Eve both present for that command? Do you guys remember?
I think Adam and Eve, were they both present for the command not to eat of the fruit?
I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know that I've heard both sides, one of which is they were both there, and what the serpent is saying is, like, are you sure you got that right? Is that really what he said? So he's attacking her own reliability, or it's the case he's attacking Adam's veracity. So in any case, the attack there isn't necessarily directly against God, because the serpent doesn't say, that's God's fault. He's attacking her memory or her interpretation but then he turns right around and says this. What does he say? Is the next temptation. Yeah, he says, God's not telling you the truth. You know why? He didn't want you to be in charge. He doesn't want you to be like him. Because if you take of this, you will become like God, knowing good and evil. And basically implies that you don't want that.
What's interesting about the second question, it's sort of presumptive that God in fact did say, don't eat of the tree of good and evil. So Satan sort of plants a little bit of uneasiness in her, and then goes for the.
It's contradicted by his next question.
Yes,
right?
it's presumptive that he did say that, but he plants this bit of uncertainty there in general, and when she's wobbly, he goes for the jugular. Yeah,
that may be the case. So if I think the interesting idea is this: what he says is, God has set up this rule in Eden. And he says, this is the way that it is in Eden. And by the way, they were fairly clear, I think, on the consequences. Because what does Satan say? God, the real thing he says God was lying about was what? That you will die. Yeah. Right? God says, on the day that you eat of it, you will die. And Satan says, that's not true. You won't die. You become like God.
Going on the theme of being kind of locked into a mindset, they presumably may have never seen death.
may have never seen
Death.
death. Yeah, that's possible as well. But at the end of the day, what I think we can agree on is the question was not, is there this evil you should do? The question was, do you trust God that He set it up in the way that's best for you? Or is it best for you to become like God? So God's put you here, but you can level up, so to speak, and be like God if you do this. Now, what was He not wrong about?
They didn't die that day, at least physically.
They did become like God in knowing good from evil. Okay, so they did level up, but at what cost? So what God is saying is, I made you, and here are animals or whatever else. Here's people. Here's maybe angels. Here's God. So there are these levels of something, whether it's power or knowledge or ability or potential or who knows what. At the end of the day, God has assigned people at certain levels, and this is true here, right? You were born, quote unquote. Let's say God is sovereignly in charge of this world. You were inserted at some point. Some of you are inserted in the lowest caste in India back in the caste day. Some of you are inserted here in Northern Virginia, which is not the lowest caste, in case you're wondering. So, but you're not among the cognoscenti who are pinky lifting and drinking in the penthouses of New York or LA, right? We're at some different level. God has put us, arguably, if He's sovereign, in some particular area with some particular role. To aspire to either a higher or a lower role than the one God wants you to do would be the same as to do what Adam and Eve did. To say God is providing this for you. He wants you to do this. And the implication is for a reason. So why would God want Adam and Eve not to eat of the tree of knowledge? And the answer was they would be living in paradise, in utopia, for all of their lives. And they would be happy because God knows that's what it would take to make them happy. As it turns out, if we opt differently, it will make us less happy. And it's only by returning to, doesn't everybody wish to regain innocence? Are there any among you who are like, what I would really like is to dirty myself up a little bit more? I think that would make me happier. Or what you want is to get clean of stuff that you don't want. And clean can mean everything from moral evil to even like, I wish I was more disciplined. I wish I was more, fill in the blank with whatever it is. All of those things are, and by the way, I don't think that Adam and Eve, imagine what is the secular heaven? It's Star Trek, right? Star Trek is the secular heaven. All of these beings living according to some purpose for the scientific discovery and exploration or whatever else. That's where they were. Adam and Eve can ask God anytime, hey, this tree is interesting. Can you tell me how it works? I can't imagine God being like, nope, that's a secret. I can't tell you that. Right? The knowledge He wanted to keep them away from was the knowledge of evil, of things that they could do that were wrong, not things that are good to learn. And so, I think a lot of our hope is to be restored to that place where we don't have to be concerned with the moral evils so that we can pursue the things that make us happy. Whether that's relational, whether it's knowledge, whether all of those things are things that God gives to people. Knowledge is talked about as a gift and in something worthy to pursue in the Bible, especially the knowledge of God. So, in any case, I've said too much about this, but in short, to natural evil, Eden is the world that God said, here's the larger world. There are more things in thy philosophy, good Horatio, or more things in the world than are dreamt of in thy philosophy. Here are all of these things out here, but here's the realm that God wanted men to stay restricted to. Man and woman elect not to do that, and God says, He doesn't explain why necessarily. No, actually, He does, doesn't He? He does explain why you can't stay in Eden, and why is that?
The tree of life.
Yes, but specifically what?
If they become life,
Live forever.
they'll live forever.
Yeah, which means what?
Oh my God.
That evil. So, what is it that limits us from developing stuff more quickly?
More quickly?
Time, resources, and oftentimes the mind that comes up with it. Like, imagine the greatest scientific mind of all time. Imagine Albert Einstein not getting old. He's Newton not getting old and dying. Gauss not getting old and dying, right? How quickly would they have ramped math and science and whatever else of a particular kind up? Or if it was twisted, how quickly would they take you off the path and drive that deeply? Okay, so that death is a limitation on the amount of evil that human beings can do. And when there was another way, we figured out how to do it, right? We were like, okay, well, we'll see if we can overcome that. We'll band together and do stuff. What did God say? Yeah, I will fragment them so that they are competing clans, groups, language groups, so that they will not be able to do the greatest kind of evil they can do. And you're like, wow, I've heard that taught in hermeneutics classes elsewhere as like obvious evidence that God is evil because he doesn't want man to obtain knowledge. He does want man to obtain knowledge, but he doesn't want him to obtain that level of knowledge out here, because what happens when we get that level of knowledge?
Corrupts you.
Yeah, it corrupts you and further. But what do we do with it?
Use it against each other usually.
Yeah, but amazing stuff, right? We're like, hey, I found an unlimited power source, not nearly unlimited power source, so I can squeeze enough energy to run a city out of a weight the size of the tables in this room for 100 years. What should we do with it? Let's light it off and kill 250,000 people, right? That's the first thing that we do with it. And I'm not saying, by the way, I'm not saying I'm not making a commentary on history on like whether good decisions were made in war or not. My point is, the human being does not necessarily do that. We tend to turn a lot of stuff into weapons, into ways to compete, and all this other kind of stuff. So if this is the case, one of the things that we want to consider is, why does God place these limitations on us? Because he doesn't want us doing this, he wants us doing this. How is he going to get us back here? I refer you to the comments from last week. But now to the point of natural evil, when you leave Eden and you say, I'm not going to trust God, I'm going to do it myself, God respects our decisions. And so imagine that you're married and your wife or husband says, I want a divorce. And you say, that's your choice. You can do that if you want. It's not, and let's pretend that you're a really good person. Let's pretend you're as good as a human being can possibly be. And you say, hey, everything I've been doing for you has only been for your own good. I'm not doing anything selfishly. And they say, I don't believe you. I don't want to be a participant anymore. I'm leaving. And they choose to leave. When they choose to leave, do you follow them around and text them and be like, hey, I know you're about to do something here, but I don't think I would do that. You know, hey, I just want to bring you some food and let you know that I think you're headed down the wrong path. How well is that going to work? You know, in that context of a divorced marriage. And this is the same thing, right? We ask for a divorce. And God says, okay, you go live in your own house. You can make your own money. Apparently he continues to pay us alimony because he still provides for the righteous and the wicked. He sends rain on all of them. He didn't just leave us all to die. So he still exists in the world that he built, but it's not ordered the way that he said to order it. So then he lets us do what we're going to do. And we get so bad that he's like, wipe them out, start over again. And then we get pretty bad again. And then he visits one guy. And he goes to Abraham and he says, I will make of you a kingdom, or I will make of you a nation. Abraham wanders around in this world. And God says, I want you to go out from where you are, and I want you to go to a land that I promised to you. Okay, so he says, here's this land I'm promised to you. Why? Because you just need some new digs? No, there's a purpose to sending him out from Ur of the Chaldeans into this land over here. And that was not simply land ownership. The idea was, you are to be a beacon, you and your people will be a beacon of light on the hill for the rest of the world to see and come back to God. And then what ends up happening is, out of this comes the nation of Israel. And the nation of Israel has all these rules, beards and covers and things to do and things to eat and not eat. Not necessarily because those things are intrinsically good or bad. I mean, God could have made, it doesn't seem to me that God couldn't have made certain kinds of fish clean and certain kinds of fish not clean. There was some reasoning behind why he did it. And some of this stuff is when I say for show, what I mean to say is to show. When you walk around in this room right now and someone says, can you guys tell me who the Jewish guys are in the room? Everybody can be like, how about the guys with kippah on? Right? There's a sign out there that says, these are people called out especially to live under the name of God. People who say, I will make God my king. And then they're supposed to be under heavy scrutiny so that we can sit there and say, if you claim to live under the kingdom of God, what does that do for you? And I'm going to look at the rest of the world. And arguably, what the nation of Israel is supposed to be is, you look at the nation of Israel, and the answer is, if you obey the laws of God, God blesses you, beyond the lot of anybody else in the world. But if you fail to, then the consequences are similar, are the opposite. And of course, the story of Messiah that we agree on is that when the Messiah comes, that he will restore this kingdom back to Israel. Israel lost it because of their own choices. He will restore it like David was doing it initially, type of thing, and greater, so that now this beacon of light is seen by the whole world and is something that everybody, so it is the tree under which all of the birds come to nest. Okay, so he's going to take this and he's going to continue to expand it outwards. Now the Christian interpretation is that Christ, Yeshua, Jesus, is Messiah, and that he will come at 2 times. The Jewish return question is when he comes back the second time, his first time in Jerusalem or not, as you've said before, right? So we'll get into that discussion later. But the idea is Eden ends up taking over the whole world. And that this world actually ends up passing away entirely, and Eden is established and takes over the new world entirely. Why is this the case? How do you do this? What was it that took us out of Eden initially?
Rebellion.
Choice. We chose not to live under God's rules. What is it that can restore us to Eden, assuming God allows it? Choice. Saying, we were wrong about that, let us live back under your discipline, live back under your commands, live back under your orders, so to speak. The voluntary nature of the kingdom is extremely important. In my opinion, this is why Christianity has in it this flavor of martyrdom and suffering outrage by others. The reason is, could a quote-unquote Christian nation of the U.S., if the U.S. were a truly Christian nation, could they, by military force, dominate the world and compel people to adopt their religion? Maybe, right? Probably, possibly. I don't know. Is that the way God wants to do it? Well, no, we don't want compelled. The whole point is if choice took you out, you want choice to take you in. It's got to be voluntary. A kingdom of voluntary servants to the king is way more powerful than a conscript army, right? And I think God's not interested in conscripts. He's not interested in people pressed into service. He's interested in people who volunteer to be part of his kingdom. So all that was a very long tour to get back to the answer to this question, and then we'll get to your question or comment. Why do we run into this evil out there? Because God is respecting the boundaries of our world. Okay, he puts a limit on it. He's not going to let us completely destroy ourselves, but he's like, if you want to live in the world that you are, where you run the whole thing, you lose the right to complain against God about what's going on. Remember do you remember what Satan's temptation, his third temptation to Christ? What does Satan say to Jesus?
Don't jump off the tower. Yeah.
No, bow down and worship me, and
all these nations will be given.
I will give you.
Yeah.
What do you mean you will give me? This is God's world. No, it's not. We walked out of God's world. I mean, he made all this. He ultimately has the rights to it, but he gave control over to us. And Satan sees the control. And by the way, who convinced us to walk out? Satan convinces us to walk out. Right? So who's actually running this stuff out here? I leave that to you to figure out. But at the end of the day, if what it means is, why is this stuff happening? You're either working for God or you're working for some other power out there. Maybe it's Satan, maybe it's a council of those things, maybe it's a council of smarter people out there, right? And I'm not saying the Colonel, the Rothschilds, the Gettys, I forget the one from So I Married an Axe Murderer. But there's always somebody out there with an idea and a plan of what's going on. So how do you know that you're not working for somebody else's plan? At the end of the day, you're either in God's world or you're in the devil's world. And so when you're in the devil's world, don't look around and be like, why is God doing it? Hey, you volunteered to be in that camp. Now, what the kingdom is, what the nation of Israel is supposed to be, what the kingdom is supposed to be, the question ought to be this: why do horrible things happen in the nation of Israel? And if you look back at the biblical account, horrible things don't happen in the nation of Israel until they rebel and say, we're going to back out of the commitment that God says to do. The same thing ought to be true in the church. When we look inside the church, what we ought to see inside a church who's part of this kingdom, these little enclaves of the kingdom that are linking together, we ought not look inside the church and say, why are horrible things happening inside the church? They don't happen inside the church. When the church is listening to the voice of God, when do they happen inside the church? When people step outside the church back into the world by the choices that they make. That is to say, what defines the kingdom and what defines the world is whether the people who claim to be in the kingdom are living in accordance with with the orders of God and when they're not. And miraculous preservation happens when people are living in accordance with the kingdom. Now, when it doesn't, because list of people who are not miraculously preserved, all of the apostles, right? But why? Now, here's my last point, and then I remember that your hand was up. I've said this to a very close relative recently. Here's this evil that is happening to you. You know that God is sovereignly in charge of this stuff. You would prefer it doesn't happen to you. But let me ask you this question. Would you be willing to trade the good that you have stolen from you if what will happen from it is that your sons, daughters, wife, husband, whatever, would in the end come to a knowledge of God and be in heaven with you? Or would you rather take the short-term benefit so that things are nice and happy and whatever here, but eventually you'll lose those people? And he very quickly says, of course I would take the latter. I would be willing to suffer that so that they may choose the kingdom. So what if God sovereignly arranged it that way? Now I refer you back to our topic from last time. The reason there are those Cat 3 and Cat 4 people who have to see evil and test evil themselves in order to sense it. If they're going to see evil and test evil themselves, it may be the case that if you're willing, God will allow that evil to happen to you, and so that other people will see it and benefit from it. And you would say, I'd be willing to take take one for the team on that one. And God uses those kinds of volunteers, and you'll notice that if the story of Christ is true, that's exactly what he did himself. The worst of it fell on him. So he was the first example in doing that. So if that's something like that is the case, you've got a reason for that. And then it may be that the Cat 4 people, they're cannon fodder, so to speak. They're disposable in terms of what evil can happen to or through them because they never would have chosen God anyway, if such people exist. Okay, your hand was up first, and then...
Yeah, it was just a point that Cindy Pryor said. Basically, my dad has the saying, says you can take a tree and bend it toward light, and it'll bend toward the light and take the light. But the idea is that if you let the tree gravitate toward the light, then it'll stay that way.
Yeah,
so basically, yeah, I mean, the point is that you can force somebody, and that'll occur, and it'll just look like things are good. But then the moment that the force exits the situation, it snaps back into the previous mode.
Yeah, that's a very good analogy as well. Yes, thank you.
So, kind of touching on this, like, why bad things happen to good people, right? So, I think it's important to note, it's not like we're not individually closed systems, right? We're part of a very complex thing, right? And so the analogy I think that I use in my brain is like, say you go out to the high desert, right? You got a pack on and you're moving, and you're in the low hills, right? But when you're in those low hills, you can't see the mountains,
right?
Because those low hills are low in relation to the mountains, but you're down in it, right?
Yep.
It's the same way, like for individuals going through, and I mean, full candor here, I haven't had a whole lot of adversity in my life, right? So I'm not speaking from a position of experience here, but I would think that when you're individually going through these trials and tribulations, like you just have to remember at aggregate, God's got the plan, right?
Yeah.
And so it may not make sense at the individual level, it will eventually make sense.
Yeah, and I think that if there's trust that God, so why can the Jew say, or based on a New Testament verse, why can the Christian say, I don't have to worry about what's happening to me now? Okay, so you're a voluntary participant in the kingdom. You're committed to God as king. You're committed to doing whatever it is he wants because you know that ultimately he has a purpose for this. Why would you be willing to suffer obvious, outrageous evil? Which, by the way, included back in the day, let's make human torches out of these guys for Nero's parties. Why would you be willing to suffer that? What's the promise that you have?
I mean, it's new heaven, new earth. Like, this is just a momentary, fleeting moment, and if that's the right thing to do, then that is the right thing to do always. And if it's a horrible death, you're comparing that to...
But this is a comparative thing. Yes, right. So compared to wars, you're right. But is the end of that, was that an end of evil? And then like, okay, that ended in evil, but eventually some other good will come in and supplant that. What does the verse that matters most in this topic say? Okay, he promises to work all things together for good for those who love him and are called according to his purpose. Okay, so the important thing is if you love him and you're called according to his purpose, which is another, we can discuss the syntax of that and the semantics of it, but ultimately, basically, if you're committed, if you're a person of the kingdom of God, then everything that happens in your life will turn out for your good and the good of others. So it's easy for me to make the case of, yeah, I'll take one for the team, also for your good. Now, how could me dying be for my good? How could me suffering this loss be for my good? Well, I can tell you in the case of the one guy I was talking about, what he has said to me since then was, I would not be the father that I am now had this not happened to me. And so for that alone, I would be willing to suffer this. Now that's fairly, that guy gets all kinds of credit in my eyes for being able to be in the midst of his trial and be like, I've been made better from this. I would not have had his attitude, probably. So I think that that's admirable, and I think that God does that in order to make some people better. At the end of the day, there will be some sort of, at least for a time, order of merit out there. Who will be greatest in the kingdom of heaven? Asked the disciples. And Jesus brings a small child in front of him and says, be like this, be like this. But ultimately, Paul says, do you not know that you will judge angels? You know, this was I understand to be a rabbinic concept of the time, or at least one of them out there, of like, there will be ultimate judgment, and that men will sit in judgment of others at some times. So if that type of thing is true, then consider what its implications are for what happens to us now. It may be that we do these, isn't it the case we say stuff like this? Bad stuff happens to these people. You say, well, I think they ought to be doing X. And somebody from inside this group turns around and says, you can't judge me because you have no idea what it's like to be X, Y, and Z, right? Now, you can't, there's one judge that you can't say that to. Hey, Jesus, you have no idea what it's like suffering like I did. I show you that picture of Mel Gibson sitting next to Jim Caviezel when he's all in the makeup, and it's a Facebook meme that says, me telling Jesus about how hard my problems are. It's that kind of concept of like, who can look at Christ and say, you don't understand, you don't get it, you can't. Some of us sitting on if I'm sitting in, I'm with you. If I'm sitting on the judge's bench and I'm saying you shouldn't have done this, someone can rightly say back to me, you don't understand my position. But sitting down higher up the dais is Paul or Peter or Andrew or somebody like that, or any of the prophets that were sawn into and stoned and thrown off cliffs and all the horrible things that have been done to them, they can turn around and be like, you can tell me I don't understand suffering for the name of Christ, for the name of God, for the kingdom? You are mistaken. So I think that there's an element of that in there as well. Now, that was a very long answer to the problem of evil, but natural evil.
I think you just touched on kind of the emotional aspect of sometimes we just need to sit at the cross and meditate
Contemplate,
on that,
yeah.
and contemplate that and think about what Christ has done for us. I'm going to push back a little bit on your theory here.
Sure.
And that is, several years ago, we had an earthquake, tidal wave, whatever it was, 300,000 people dead. Are you telling me that there wasn't plate tectonics in the Garden of Eden? I mean, it seems to me that you're saying that there was not only a moral change, but a physical change to the world. And if so, why was Adam told to maintain the garden?
Yeah. So I don't, well, let's use plate tectonics as an example. This will not be exhaustive, but let's say, okay, plate tectonics is going to be responsible for earthquakes, volcanic action, or as a consequence of these kinds of things. Are there places on Earth where those are not problems? No? I mean, like, are there places on Earth that you're safe from death, from earthquake, tidal wave, or volcanic action? Like mid-plate, right? There's places mid-plate that's not going to happen to you.
Not even mid-plate. I mean, you would say we're not in the middle of a plate. Well, yeah, we had mineral, back in 2011 or so. And, there were cracks in the buildings. We had to repair the Washington Monument.
Yeah, certainly, but I'm back to the building thing of like, okay, well, if you live in Eden, if they say Eden would not be in the middle of Kansas, But if Eden's in the middle of Kansas, and you start to build a house, or you might, hopefully, if you're in the garden, you would say, God, do I need a house now? Rain seems to coming over top. Well, maybe that doesn't happen at the time. That seemed to have been the case, right? So, in any case, you say, well, what should my house look like? And God says, build the house like this. And then that house would be earthquake-proof. You're going to be volcano-proof by being in the middle of Kansas. The earthquakes that hit Kansas are so reduced in force that it was kind of like, was that an earthquake? I don't know. That was like a 10 on the Richter scale over there. We barely felt it. So there are places, my point would be, there is no Eden now. Like even if Eden was where we currently think it might have been, some people think it might have been, which is basically up in Turkey or in who knows where. But you can't go there now and say, yeah, this is still a safe place. Because God, knowing what he knows is, Eden won't be there anymore because he knew we were going to choose our way out of it. But had it continued to be there, it would have been a safe place, is my point. Am I making sense?
Turkey.
Not in Turkey now, but
Right.
I think God knew that would be the
then,
case.
unless you're telling me that plate tectonics did not exist, right? I mean, because Accra has a lot of earthquakes and a lot of people die, regardless of whether or not you're in a stone building or not.
My point would be you can live in an area of earthquakes and not die.
Possibly.
Certainly.
You certainly can't live on the west coast of certain islands in the South Pacific or Southeast Asia and be safe from a tidal wave.
Right, unless you always know when tidal waves will occur. So remember, if you're living in the garden with God, remember, God's walking in the garden in the cool of the day. Adam and Eve hide from him, right? You have daily access to talking to God. So imagine you're like, hi God, hi, how's it going? No, we're just picking some apples today. Yeah, that's a good idea. I'll tell you something else you ought to do. When noon rolls around, when the sun gets to the hot spot, you guys should go stand on top of the hill. Why is that? Because a whole bunch of water is going to wash through here. I mean, at the end of it, God wouldn't let that happen in Eden, in the same way it's not rolling through Kansas either. But my point would be, if you're talking to God every day, anything that would come your way, God, or you start to build your house, he's like, I don't know if I would do that. This following thing will happen and it will fall down on you.
So you're not saying that natural hazards would be, you're saying that natural hazards would still be there, it's just that you would know better than to...
I mean, I'm speculating. Hopefully everybody recognizes I'm speculating heavily, right?
I'm questioning your...
Speculation?
Your statement that Eden was perfect in the way that we think is perfect.
This is the world, okay? And all of that stuff, let's say all that stuff is there. This is Eden. That little dot that you can't see on the screen that I circled and then circled again.
Right.
That's the size of Eden in that world. Now, ultimately, arguably, it's got to get bigger as Adam and Eve have kids. But ultimately, what were Adam and Eve's orders? Does anybody remember Adam and Eve's orders?
When?
They got two orders. Two things they were supposed to do. Multiply, fill the earth, and subdue it. Which is, by the way, we're trying to do. When we build earthquake-proof buildings, we're trying to subdue the earth. Sure. When we build shelters, tornado shelters, we're trying to subdue the earth. When we try to figure out what we're going to do with carbon emissions and whether that helps or not, we're trying to subdue the earth. These are all manners of control. When we build fences from wild animals, we try to subdue. When we train animals not to attack us, we're subduing the earth. This is us doing our best to control the stuff that's out here. Had we progressed out of Eden the way we were supposed to, all of the earth would have fallen under God-directed optimal control. And where control is like garden control, not like 1984 control, right? Like the control that you have in a garden. We plant gardens, we develop gardens so that the trees form pleasing shapes, sometimes French topiary, sometimes, what an English garden. They yield fruit for us the best way we can, all that kind of stuff. We do those. Those are controls that we set over the natural order that's out there to improve it. God wanted us to do that, to improve it for a purpose. God wanted us to do that. I would tell you that in a world where God is the chief engineer, you don't have any deaths due to natural illness or action. In the same way that you don't have typhoon deaths in Okinawa. So whoever his people are that go out and live in Okinawa, he's like, go, fill Okinawa, be fruitful, multiply, build houses out of concrete. You're going to want that. It's going to be important later. I mean, I'm exaggerating, and then there's some people who think that a lot of these natural evils are some sort of semi-magical consequence of the fall. And maybe that's the case, maybe it's not.
That's
But-
what I'm pushing against.
Even if you do push against that, the point is it's possible to live at any spot on the earth and not die from natural causes if you know how to obviate those natural causes.
I mean, we have some biblical evidence for that. When Israel was being led into the land, he said that they would take it bit by bit, otherwise the wild animals would be too much for them. So there was natural evil there, and he had a process by which he was controlling that natural evil so it won't harm them.
All right, then our last minute or 6 minutes for those that, I've pretended this class ends at 10:20. If you need to walk out before, then do. Here's where we sit. We examined the positive arguments for God. You've heard me talk about that plenty. We've examined what I consider to be the lead arguments against God, at least a couple of them, because those are the only ones that really consistently show back up. I've given some minor treatment to some others. Open offer, anytime, through the rest of this year. Any argument, anytime you want to come back and be like, you gave too short a shrift to the arguments against God. I got one for you, bring it up. We will stop the class and bring that one up, because I do not want to ever be accused of we're dodging the best arguments or anything out there. So always, always, always bring those up anytime you want, please. What we will do now is start to transition. These guys have been testing their patience by them sitting and listening to stuff that they already know or isn't directly germane to some of the problems that they would like to talk, I imagine, but they're very gracious. We have only really established the existence of a God-like construct, a person. Now we're down to, okay, fine, Christians, and it's particularly poignant with Jews in the room, Christians and Jews, which one of you guys has got this right? And of course, forget these guys for a second, look amongst ourselves. We're Protestants, God pity us for this, where there are 1,000 versions of us out there. So who's got it kind of quote unquote right? Well, we'll start delving down that path next time. And what I would like to do next time, the first half of the class or so, will be asking a question that hopefully occurs to you fairly quickly. And this is an interesting question, so think about it this week. How right does one have to be? And about what?
For what?
Right?
For what?
For what? I'll leave that one open. For what? And so what question are we trying to answer? When we say, who's got it right, what is it that we're trying to get right, and how right do we have to have it? I've never met a person who says, well, if I said, do you think that literally every single thing that you believe about your religion, with no exceptions, is 100% true, you don't have any of it wrong? Nobody's ever committed to me on that one and said, yeah, I've got it nailed. Ask me a question. Go. Everybody's like, that could be. I'm like, what percent right do you have to be? And usually, if to the Christian, I'll say, to a Christian, I'll usually say, in order to be saved. Right? And then that's when stuff we talked about. How deeply do you scope the core things of Christianity where you're like, no, I've got to have this right to some standard in order to be saved. What is that standard, et cetera? So I guess I'm asking the question, I think it's fair to say, probably we'll end up talking about what we call salvation. But let me characterize salvation for you in a specific way that both the Christian and the Jew would agree, and the Muslim would agree with. That salvation means living in the kingdom of God eternally. All right, so let that be broad. What? You disagree?
Reconciling man to God.
For what purpose? But when Jesus says that, what does that reconciliation do?
It brings man to God in the
Okay, so now man's with...
presence of God and in the existence of God.
So we're in the presence of God now, but let's say we're in the special presence of God, whatever that means. What's the consequence?
Eternal.
Yeah, so, right.
Eternal life with God, if God is eternal.
All right, I'm happy with that. With 2 more stops, but yes,
Yeah.
same
And I've noticed in
destination.
here, we always talk about the beginning. Is there a creation? We haven't really talked about what does the ending look like.
Yeah, by the way, I have a theory about the ending that you'll either really, really like or you'll really, really not like. We'll get to that one
If
eventually.
God created the universe, is there an end to the universe, and what does that look like?
I have thought a lot about this, and I have an answer that I love.
It's 2021, right?
But we'll get to that one later. It doesn't, to my knowledge, it doesn't happen in
No, I'm
2021.
saying that's the topic of the whole year.
The whole year 2020, I don't know if I could expand that into a whole topic.
I got you.
It actually is it's a simple idea and a simple answer. But In any case, we're going to start answering the questions where the divisions between Muslims, Jews, and Christians, and the divisions between individual sects of Muslims, Jews, and Christians. So don't ever, you can't look at Judaism and say, those guys are, it's Judaism. Yeah, which version? We've got Reformed, and you've got Orthodox, and you've got Hasidic of various types, and you've got all kinds of stuff, and you guys are on the hook for describing those to whatever degree you think is helpful, please, if you'd be so kind. The Muslim, the Islamic world does this. Is the Islamic world a monolith, or is there a single major division within Islam where they will kill each other dead over that one? And even when you get into Sunni Islam, you've got, Al Qaeda is really, I'll take 30 seconds on this just to. Al Qaeda is Al Qaeda for a set of particular religious beliefs. They are Salafis and Takfiris who believe that you should live like the apostles of Muhammad, basically, that should be the guideline of how you live, and that people who do not adhere to core doctrines of Islam are the first enemies, not the second enemies out there. They're the worst ones, and they're the ones, this is why they cut heads off of other Muslims more frequently than they do other infidels. So, because those guys are hypocrites and apostates, and they deserve death more than the simple non-believer. In fact, a non-believer isn't instantly guilty. The non-believer, you have a responsibility to present Islam properly to the non-believer, and it's only when they fight against you that you fight against them. So when you actually examine Al Qaeda deep down, they're not as, they're obviously, I still think they're bad, but they're not as bad as they're caricatured to be. They have a set of fairly logical religious beliefs that lead them to their conclusion. And that's a further division simply among a particular branch of Islam. So all that to say, and then of course that doesn't say anything about the nonviolent portions of it. As you're thinking through all these things, anytime you look at another religion, remember that there are divisions among that one. So we have to ask the question of where is the kind of quote-unquote right answer, and what's our diagnostic series of techniques to figure out what the truth is, because that's what we're going to have to do. At the end of the day, if you walk out of this class at the end of this year, semester, whatever else, and you say, I'm leaving this class as a Christian, as a Jew, as a Protestant, as a Protestant Christian, a Catholic Christian, an Orthodox Christian, I'm starting my new denomination because I think that this new set of things is right. At some point, you have to walk out of this class now, having examined, you will have listened at least to something that's going to cause you to examine your own beliefs and the beliefs of others, and you have to come to a conclusion about what am I going to take as my residual beliefs or as my total group of beliefs, and this is how I'm going to live my life. I think that's an important thing to do, and it means you guys got a decision ahead of you, as long as you're still hanging out in here, for the next few weeks or months. So with that in mind, come next time, let's start that kind of thought specifically, but if you have not given any thought yet to what do I need to know and how do I know it's true, then you'll be a little bit behind. So try to think about that a little bit this week. Thanks very much. We appreciate you being here and for the great discussion so far, and we look forward to it next week. You guys have a good one. Yes, sir.
Yes, that's the idea. I'm a little different case. Yeah. Divisions.